kabayo, yan ang alam. Karaniwang hanap buhay, karaniwan ang problema, pagkain, damit at tirahan. Di ko kabisado yang siyensya, ako'y nalilito sa maraming salita. Alam ko lang na itong planeta'y walang kapalit at dapat ingatan. Kapag nasira, sino ang kawawa? Karaniwang tao, saan ka tatakbo? Kapag nawasak, iisang mundo. Karaniwang tao, anong magagawa upang bantayan ang kalikasan? Karaniwang bagay ay di pansin. Kapag naipon ay nagiging suliranin. Kaunting basura ngayon'y bundok, kotseng gabok ay umuusok. Sa buong panlabay pumapatay sa ilog. May lasong galing sa industriya, ibinubuga ng mga pabrika. Ngunit di lamang higante ang nagkakalat ng dumi, may kinalaman din ang tulad natin. Karaniwang tao, saan ka tatakbo? Kapag nawasak, iisang mundo. Karaniwang tao, anong magagawa upang bantayan ng kalikasan? Tatakbo kapag nawasak iisang mundo. Karaniwang tao, anong magagawa upang bantayan ang kalikasan? Karaniwang tao, karaniwang tao, karaniwang tao, karaniwang tao, karaniwang tao, saan ka tatakbo? Kapag nawasak iisang mundo. Karaniwang tao, anong magagawa upang bantayan ang kalikasan? Karaniwang tao, karaniwang tao, karaniwang tao, karaniwang tao, karaniwang tao.
Welcome back to the Philippine Sociological Society 2020 National Conference. I am Louis Benedict Ignacio. I am from the University of Santo Tomas. So this is the fourth day of our technically week-long online conference with the theme Transitions, Transgressions, and Transformation. So how are you? How are you feeling and doing today? I can see from our chat box that we have participants coming from Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, and even from other parts outside other parts of the world outside of the country. So far, we have 222 participants coming in, and we hope to have more as we proceed with today's session. So, in the past 3 days of our online session, we've had one keynote and one plenary already, and a number of parallel sessions. Very dynamic, very diverse discussions within our parallel sessions, and very, very insightful, okay, paper presentations. And I hope you are absorbing as much information, as much insight as you can to maximize this gathering of sociologists, both teachers, practitioners, and students. So we invite you as well to share your PSS 2020 National Conference experience by using our official hashtag. That's PSS 2020 Conference and hashtag sociologyph. So whether you're on Instagram or on Twitter or even on Facebook, use our official hashtag to share your experience. Also, I'd like to take this opportunity to invite new members and remind our current and old members to renew your membership to the Philippine Sociological Society. Some of the perks include participating in conferences like this, a copy of the Philippine Sociological Review, insights coming from the members of the society, our newsletter, and other activities and engagements that the society offers exclusively to its members. So if you're not yet a member, or if you have not renewed your membership, then this is a very good opportunity for you to renew your membership. So on to today's main agenda. For today, we'll have our last plenary speaker, but I'm telling you, definitely not the least of our plenary speakers. Also, this particular session is very special because this is a joint session together with the Philippine Social Science Council, because this is a session wherein the PSSC will also be awarding a very special award to our plenary speaker for this morning. So to introduce to us the award, we have the Executive Director of the Philippine Social Science Council. Let's watch the video of Dr. Portus.
Officials and members of the Philippine Sociological Society, representatives from the Ateneo de Manila University and the Polytechnic University of the Philippines, participants to this online national conference, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a lovely morning to everyone. During the opening ceremonies of the successful PSS conference, I lauded PSS winning streak as far as being able to first.
Okay, I think we just had a very slight technical glitch on that part. We'll play again that video from PSSC, and as mentioned by Dr. Cortuz, this is an awarding ceremony as well for the Virginia A. Miralao Excellence Award. But I'll let Dr. Cortuz give you the details of that award later on. So just a few house rules. Before we begin, we are using Webinar Jam as a platform for our session this morning. So if ever you encounter any connection problems during the webinar, please click the reconnect button found at the top of your screen to make sure that you can reconnect with the session and try to reboot or solve your connection problems. Also, if you have comments, questions about the discussions, you may use the chat box on the right side of your screen. Please state your name and your affiliation together with your questions and or your comments. Also, we are friends here, we are colleagues here, and we value respect and courtesy the most during our session. So we make our engagement and interactions with the other members of the session very pleasant and very respectful. So I guess we have tried to resolve the problem on the video. Again, let us watch the video message coming from Dr. Lourdes Portus, Executive Director of the Philippine Social Science Council.
Officials and members of the Philippine Sociological Society, representatives from the Ateneo de Manila University and the Polytechnic University of the Philippines, participants to this online national conference, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a lovely morning to everyone. During the opening ceremonies of the successful PSS conference, I lauded PSS winning streak as far as being able to first, mount a conference despite the pandemic restrictions. Second, PSS members serving as editor and contributors of the Crime and Punishment book are now immortalized, and as we go to press with their worthy studies printed for posterity. And third reason of PSS to celebrate is its distinguished member, Dr. Nicole Curato's triumph as the 2020 Virginia Miralao Excellence in Research Award. Let me show you a short video to know more of this award. It was a hands-down win, with the Board of Judges unanimously picking the book, Democracy in a Time of Misery, from a set of nominees. As a fitting tribute to our awardee, She will not only receive cash, but will own a unique creation by visual artist Toym Imaw, who designed the VAM trophy using welded metals finished in polyurethane. He artistically shaped the PSSC acronyms into flames to symbolize knowledge. All the letters or acronyms take the form of the element fire to further depict wisdom as an interminable pursuit among social scientists. Prominent in the trophy is a face almost shaped like a heart and whose eyes penetrate what is inside the brain and by extension, what is inside the soul. This is the face of the social scientist, and the metaphors of the heart and the eyes portray the social sciences that critically study events in society and their effects on its people. In particular, the heart represents the care and desire to be of service to society and to be concerned with the country's development. Perched on a high platform made of ripples connoting upward movements, the trophy stands tall for two reasons: to have a vantage point on social phenomena and to be visible, as in giving recognition to the efforts of the social sciences to contribute to Philippine communities' development. This VAM trophy is placed on a pedestal to represent such acknowledgement and gratitude as it is bestowed to the exceptional awardee. As the video has shown, we have awarded 8 social scientists for their excellence in research. It is again a proud moment for PSS to know, out of the 8 awardees, 50% comes from PSS. Dr. Jail Cornelio, Dr. Leloy Claudio, Dr. Jonathan Ong, and now Dr. Nicole Curato. What a remarkable PSS exploit of populating the VAM Awards. Another notable first that PSS has accomplished is that your Dr. Curato is the first lady awardee to receive the VAM Awards. For this year's awarding, PSS has instituted a new feature, which is that of a lecture to be delivered by the awardee. I think this is what we most are waiting for. So, as we hand over the cash and prize and the trophy to Dr. Curato, this will be followed by her lecture. Congratulations, Dr. Curato.
Good morning, Philippine Sociological Society. It is also my pleasure to introduce to you our plenary speaker for this morning. Allow me to introduce Dr. Nicole Curato the way we endorse her for the Virginia A. Miralao Excellence in Research Award. Of course, this endorsement is also with the help of Dr. Nympha Bracamonte, our honorary member of the Philippine Sociological Society. First, Nicole Curato is an associate professor at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. Of course, she's the author of this award-winning book, Democracy in a Time of Misery, From Spectacular Tragedy to Deliberative Action, published by the Oxford University Press. Nicole also served as the Secretary of the Philippine Sociological Society from 2014 to 2016. As humankind incessantly grapples with the repercussions of natural and social disasters, Nicole Curato's book, The Democracy in a Time of Misery, is a profound and remarkable contribution to understanding people's misery in living democratic action. Her work is exemplary in disaster and conflict-affected communities, providing strong theoretical insights and methodological reflections. Drawing from the deliberative democratic action and normative media studies, the book unpacks the varying modes of how political agents articulate, enact, and contest their spectacular tragedies to deliberative action. Curato displays academic integrity, ensuring her claims are anchored on empirical evidences through extensive fieldwork and observance of research ethics. Interestingly, the style of writing appeals to all sectors as she documents the voices and lived experience of the survivors, particularly the process of rebuilding and bouncing back from the untoward event resembling a kite in a hurricane, to use Curato's metaphor. Upholding that nature humbles human reason, the author bears witness to others' sufferings and connects to the vulnerabilities and risks of the people by going back to some research areas and assisting them in modest ways, akin to her response to some emerging needs of the internally displaced Bajau and Miralao women and children in Mindanao. Her works inspire many young emerging scholars in sociology, history and humanities, media, communications, and other related fields in the social sciences. The Philippine Sociological Society is very proud of Dr. Nicole Curato for this prestigious award. Ladies and gentlemen, our plenary speaker, Dr. Nicole Curato.
Hi, Vads. Good morning.
Good morning, Nicole.
Hi, Louis. Good morning. And to everybody in this plenary session, good morning.
Before anything else, I guess it's just proper to send our biggest congratulations to you for winning the VAM award this year and being the first woman to receive the award. How does it feel?
Siyempre overwhelming because this award is nominated by the PSS and it's given by the PSSC. I think that's really meaningful. And if we look at the previous prize winners coming from PSS, I think it demonstrates the breadth of sociological knowledge that we bring. Like Jail Cornelio works on religion, Jonathan Ong works on media. So parang pinapakita lang talaga nito ang contributions ng sociologists in the field of social sciences. Pero Louis, pwede ba ako magpaka-showbiz for a bit?
Sure.
This is also the opportunity to acknowledge that this book is very much a collective project, even if it's a single authored book. The field work is not exclusively done by myself. In fact, a lot of the work that has gone within the field work is completed with the support of two amazing research assistants, that's Pamela Combinido and April Porteria. So when I say we, when I start talking about the book, kasali sila dito. But of course, all the mistakes that I commit are solely my mistakes. And the research associates in this project have been nothing but fantastic. So maraming salamat. And of course, I'd be remiss not to say thank you to the people of Tacloban, especially the respondents who took part in the research project. I think one siguro limitation lang is we can't name them because we want to respect the anonymity and confidentiality of our respondents. But I've done my best to personally thank them for participating in the project. So yeah, that's my showbiz component.
Thank you, Nicole. And I guess the one thing that will be unique as well in this particular plenary session is that rather than you straightforwardly giving a lecture, this will be a conversation, and this will be a portion wherein you'll share your thoughts, what you have written in the book, and how this is really a reflection of the experiences on the ground after a tragedy, after a disaster, and how we see its relevance even today, most especially to today. So for our participants, for our attendees to this plenary session, we have 292 participants. So please feel free to send in your comments, your questions to Dr. Nicole Curato. You can just type in through the chat box in on the right side of your screen, your questions or your comments. Okay, so let's start the ball rolling, Nicole. Okay, so I was just wondering because you have your academic preparations all in the field of sociology. Your undergraduate, your MA, and even your PhD degree is in sociology. And here we are reading a book about a very political scenario, a very political concept. I'm not saying that we cannot do that. I'm actually saying that that's one beauty, isn't it, of sociology. But how do you meet or how do you allow the intersection between these two disciplines, sociology and the study of politics? And how do you manifest this in your line of research, your line of work in the academe as well.
Right, and I think, Louis, it's perfect that this conversation is happening with you because you yourself are a political sociologist, so an incredible honor. So you're right, all my degrees are in sociology, but the focus of my study has always been in the field of politics. And I think one beauty of sociology as a discipline is that it's never territorial. It's very welcoming and embracing of different perspectives. We are comfortable to speak to political scientists in the same way we're comfortable to speak to anthropologists, in the same way that we embrace our colleagues from the humanities, where we can learn how to articulate our perspectives in a more engaging, less, I don't know, intimidating, yung ma-jargon na hindi naman nakakapag-paminaw ng mga kaganapan sa lipunan. So I think we also embrace that style of the more mas literature-framed approach to writing. So when we talk about my own work, when it comes to political sociology, sa tingin ko, ang connection ito with all the sociological work or the discipline itself is embracing the idea that sociologists make the familiar strange. Hindi ba? Na parang Zygmunt Bauman, Peter Berger, and Luckman always challenge us to critically examine the social construction of reality, to take nothing for granted, to always interrogate what we mean when we say this is ordinary. So I think yun yung lapit ko when I start studying politics. So in this book, my methodological approach is ethnographic. I must admit I wasn't able to do the ethnography that I really wanted to do, which is to really embed myself with the community and live with them for extended periods, kasi may limitations din kami sa research ethics from my university. But what I did was to spend, ayan na yung I, ito na yung ibig sabihin, kasama ko dito si April at si Fab. What we did was we spent almost 3 years going in and out of Tacloban and trying to understand the lived realities of everyday citizens. And I think this is what sets the book apart from the usual way we understand politics, because when we study politics, when we study democracy, parati na lang ang tinitignan yung Congress or yung executive or yung formal structures of governance. Of course, that's important. These are valid, obviously very important and central ways of understanding how democracy works. But from a sociological perspective, I want to understand how democracy is constructed from the lived experiences of everyday people. So in fact, in the book, wala akong elite interviews masyado eh. I didn't cite the mayor, I didn't cite the head of the housing committee or a lot of humanitarians. That was not really the interest. My interest was really to understand how politics is performed in the everyday lives of respondents, people who literally lost everything from Typhoon Yolanda in 2013.
Correct. And I think this is a very good opportunity as well, especially because majority of our attendees are really young students of sociology. We have students, senior high school students and undergraduate students taking up sociology. And I guess this is an opportunity for them to see how broad sociology can be and how, just like you said, welcoming sociology as a field in terms of research direction, in terms of the phenomena that we can understand, and how our research methodologies, as you have mentioned, can really capture the uniqueness in everyday experiences. And with this, I'd like to be more specific on your line of research. You're working on deliberative democracy. At first, when you hear the term deliberative democracy, people might think, oh, that's very political. But how is this very sociological as well?
Right. So as Bads mentioned earlier, I work at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance here at the University of Canberra. And nahihirapan nga akong sabihin kasi it's such a mouthful, it's such a tongue twister, deliberative democracy. But for our audience who may be hearing about the term for the first time, deliberative democracy, I would define it as both as a political aspiration and a political project. So as a political aspiration, ang goal lang naman ng deliberative democracy is to place reasoned discussion or deliberation at the heart of political life. Now, I know a lot of skeptics there already say, ano namang pantasya yan, di ba? Hello, wala na ang reasoned discussion na nagaganap ngayon. Puro disinformation, propaganda, filter bubbles, di ba? How can we have intelligent conversations these days? And this is exactly why I say this is a political aspiration. And the point here is that when we think about our democratic aspirations, hindi na, I think, enough to think about having free, fair, and competitive elections as the aspiration for what democracy looks like. So in a way, we can say deliberative democracy, as Simone Chambers argues, is a talk-centric rather than a vote-centric approach to politics. Which brings me to deliberative democracy as a political project. Ang challenge ngayon is for us, ordinary citizens, and ewan ko, medyo give up na kasi ako sa politicians, di ba? Parang kung meron mga kaganapan dyan sa Congress, which is supposed to be a deliberative body, parang ewan ko, bala kayo dyan. My interest is how we as ordinary citizens can construct spaces where deliberation can actually take place. This conference is an example. Classroom discussions are another example where we can have inclusive conversations that can inform the decisions that we make as a society. So I think the sociological aspect of deliberative democracy is trying to understand how basically everyday citizens try to build on this political aspiration. For me, it looks at the micro-politics of how we engage in political discussion on Twitter, on Facebook, in face-to-face conversations, because I think these micro-political acts are not insignificant. Pag may nagsabi sa'yo na, okay, naging deliberative ka sa Facebook when you're debating with your friend, hindi naman niya masosolve yung problema ng lipunan. Well, hindi niya masosolve ang problema ng lipunan, but it's habit forming. And I think that is the challenge for us as educators and as sociologists, to think about ways we can promote deliberation in our everyday lives, such that our broader societal conversations will embody deliberative virtues.
Okay, and I guess that's a good platform already for our audience to know you more and how you work and what you're working on and at in terms of your academic and research career. Now let's proceed to the book itself, and the book that allowed you to get this award is Democracy at a Time of Misery. It's such a very, I think when I first read the title of the book, I thought it's very literary in a sense, using the word misery. But to look at the concept of misery is, I think it's a difficult task, because it's something that may be very personal. Okay, it may be very personal for some, but in the book you've seen how this personal emotion has accumulated, has transformed. So maybe my question is, how did you define misery first in the book, and how did it develop? How did it transform into being a significant material in the process of democracy?
Right. I think the best way for me to answer this question is to tell a story, how I came up with the theme of democracy in a time of misery. So when I got a research grant in 2015 to study Tacloban, my pitch actually was quite different. My pitch was to understand governance practices in a post-disaster area. So very straightforward, actually. I just wanted to do a mapping exercise of different ways in which local government, humanitarian organizations, and the barangays try to implement participatory practices. So very governance-oriented. I was working in a governance institute. So to me, nung pagdating ko sa field, yun yung task. But then, when we started doing our interviews, it's hard not to parang be captivated by the way how our respondent explained how miserable they felt. And so they were talking about, they used the word miserable, napahiya, nawalang hiya, nakalimutan. I mean, these are very emotional words. And so when I look back on our transcripts, parang feeling ko, hindi ko to pwedeng i-ignore kasi sobrang obvious niya. When we were in Tacloban in 2014, 2015, the markers of misery are so obvious. You have makeshift graves in I think it was a highway. There's a mass grave, medyo outskirts of the city, but the mass grave is there. The commemoration ceremonies of Typhoon Yolanda, yung mga candle lighting ceremonies, all of these are markers of misery. And I think dito na papasok yung advantage ng pagiging sociologist. Kasi parang, if something is so obvious, if something is so in your face, we take it for granted. Now, of course, malungkot sila. Siyempre, nayolanda sila eh. Now, of course, namatayan sila, malungkot sila. But what sociology teaches us is that, but wait a minute, what is obvious needs to be unpacked. What is in your face needs to be problematized. Kaya dun pumasok yung, I guess, yung theoretical project of trying to understand why misery, how people construct misery, how they articulate their misery, and how that relates to their democratic practice. So I guess to answer your question, how I define misery, dalawang levels. Yung individual level of misery, which can be manifest in the form of mourning, of grieving. You have, for example, mothers who lost their children and grieve that in a mass grave. Or maybe some of you will remember yung testimony ni Mayor Alfred Romualdez sa Congress when he shared how his family was almost engulfed by a tsunami and barely survived. Sorry, not the tsunami, but the storm surge. So this is a very individualistic approach to misery. It's inward looking. But what I started to realize in this project is actually misery also takes place on the collective level, that misery can be politicized to parang encourage democratic action. So the book has many examples of this. I think one of my favorite examples is from the social movement called People Surge. So this is an alliance of disaster survivors, and I think semantically important yun, they call themselves survivors, not victims, because that's very agentic, di ba? Na they can shape the terms of the political conversation. So yung mga naunang protesta ng People Surge, ginagamit nila yung emotion of mourning and suffering to express their discontent with the way the Aquino administration responded with Typhoon Yolanda. I'm fully cognizant that this is a debate that many people think na parang, ginagamit niyo lang yung tragedy para to put forward political gains, or parang there's another paper I published that says, we haven't even buried the dead yet. I heard that from one respondent na hindi pa nga nalilibing yung mga bangkay, climate change kayo dyan. But I think this is precisely the point, how misery can actually enliven democratic action, on how misery can enliven our political agencies to secure political gains.
And for me, I think it's very fascinating to see how this strong emotion is maximized in a sense to form a collective, okay? And it's visible in the book how the concept of collective is very relevant in this discussion. So I guess that's something that not really confuses me, but is of interest to me, because common response maybe for some who have been in a disaster or who was a victim of a typhoon or a calamity, the first thing that they would do is to either save themselves, save their family, make sure that they are safe, make sure that they can provide enough for their family while everything still is at a chaos. So I'm thinking, what made them realize or even think of forming collectives despite the chaos that is already happening, from thinking only of themselves and, as what you've said, mourn because of their personal experiences. What do you think made them decide or made them realize that to form a collective is something of significance, or it would be better if they would form a collective to address both their personal and communal concerns?
Yes, actually, lahat ng empirical chapters ng libro, naka-organize siya around the concept of a public. Kasi when we think about the concept of the collective or the public in theoretical literature, let's say the public sphere ni Habermas, we just assume that this is historically generated, di ba? Na porque may enlightenment, bigla ka na lang may public sphere of learned, white, straight men in a cafe and salons salons talking about public issues and how to contest those public issues. I actually push back against that, yung konsepto ng public sphere or yung konsepto ng collective na napakalutang, na napakataas ng expectations na for you to be considered part of the public, kailangan may impact yung collective action nyo, kailangan meron siyang aspiration to change the society in a revolutionary manner. I push back against it because I think we can celebrate collective action from the perspective of modest and humble achievements. So what do I mean? So for example, when we think about how disaster-affected communities communities who are vulnerable to disasters, how they prepare for the disaster, we usually see it from the perspective of, kasi pasaway, sinabihan na nga mag-evacuate, di pa mag-evacuate, di ba? And I think it's the same for COVID, di ba? Sinabihan na nga mag-social distancing, bakit pa tumatambay sa kanto? Parating deficit-oriented yung description sa mga vulnerable communities, parating sila yung may kasalanan, parating victim blaming. But when we actually listen to their stories, why they decide the way they do in preparation for the disaster, they actually have the collective in mind. So for example, when you ask a fisherman, bakit ka tumambay dito sa lugar ninyo, whereas yung pamilya mo lumikas na dun sa evacuation center, bakit ka natira sa bahay? Ang sagot, kasi gusto ko bantayan yung bangka ko, baka maanod. And gusto niyang bantayan yung bangka niya kasi ayaw niya na pag nagkaroon ng disaster, aasa siya sa gobyerno kasi nawala na siya ng bangka. So it's very forward-looking. It's very civic-minded, di ba? Na ayokong maging kabigat. And I think it's the same for a lot of the disaster survivors in Tacloban as well na, ayun na nga, sinabihan na nga maghanda kayo, hindi kayo naghanda. Actually, naghanda sila. Meron pa nga bumili ng Ziploc bag. Halang Ziploc ha, in fairness. Meron bumili ng Ziploc bag para ilagay doon yung cellphone niya kasi alam niya na mababasa. Parang from our perspective as middle-class people who have all the resources, parang hindi yun big deal. Pero if we understand it from their context, understanding how hard it is to act collectively and think in civic-minded terms, I think these are modest achievements that are worth celebrating. So maraming examples dun sa libro, and I think all of these examples are trying to, I guess, smash this impression that just because they are not in the most well-off conditions, just because they have limited material resources, the only way they practice their citizenship is to become citizens na palamunin, which is a concept that they really hate because they find that getting relief from the government, getting relief from humanitarian organizations is so humiliating. Lalo na kung ibibigay sa yung relief good ay panis na kanin. At parang some mothers even say, parang kahit baboy hindi yan kakainin. So hindi nila gusto yun. And I think we have to smash this narrative na pinapakinabangan lang nila yung disaster, swerte naman nila hindi sila nagtatrabaho. But really, when we try to understand the democratic labor, what goes on behind the scenes, the everyday decisions that they make, they're forming the collective, they're forming a public. The problem is, we can't see that public. People like us who are very far from them are becoming so judgmental and not appreciative of the kind of public that they're forming. So in a way, the book gives testament to the micro-political actions, humble and everyday achievements that disaster-affected communities have accomplished given very trying times.
And I guess, especially for our very young sociology students, lahat naman dumaan kay C. Wright Mills and the sociological imagination and the intersection between the biological, the personal, and the public. And I guess this is a good manifestation. This is a good example of how sociology sees that intersection between our personal lives and how we are part of a bigger collective and how we are affected and in a way influence that bigger collective in the same way. I'd like to dig deeper into your discussion, the last part. Do you think, well, the part we're in, some do not see how it is coming from their experience, the survivors in Tacloban, of how they would not want to be seen as a pabigat, or palamunin or asa sa tulong ng iba, and how people in social media, for example, would see some negativity or minsan toxic na siya, minsan super woke na yung ibang tao na when they see people helping, they do not see it as something positive. They see it really just an image. And with your experience engaging with the survivors in Tacloban, how do they position themselves towards that discourse? Kasi I'm thinking, iba yung nangyayari sa social media. People are talking in social media. People are exchanging and debating in social media. But that's totally different from what is actually happening on the ground. So I'm wondering, how did the survivors in Tacloban see that discourse in a totally different world? And how do they think it affects them in the long run?
Yes, so dito medyo hihiram na ako sa trabaho ng favorite colleague ko ni Jonathan Ong. So Jonathan has actually put forward the concept of ideal victimhood. And his argument is that, and napansin ko rin to in my own project, when we look at portrayals of disaster survivors in social media, karamihan ng mga discourse na pinapakita sa social media is the importance of the ideal victim. The ideal victim is someone who suffers, may performative resilience, di ba? Kaya parang yung mga memes at that time, I don't know kung naalala to ng mga bagets, 2013 pa kasi. Pero ang daming memes na, di ba? The Filipino spirit is stronger than the typhoon, or the Filipino spirit is like a bamboo, di ba? Na parang it's also very resilient, or pray for the Philippines. Or yung Department of Tourism at that time spent the advertising budget creating or posting billboards in Times Square, Piccadilly Circus in London, na nakalagay, the Philippines says thank you. Tapos merong performer na may nakahawak na Santo Niño or something, showing that we are grateful victims. Thank you, world, for supporting the Philippines. And okay, that's such a nice picture, and it circulates in social media. It's kind of soothing. It gives comfort in a very difficult time. But I think the problem, if we just see the Filipino disaster survivors within the lens of the ideal victim, is that it silences the discourses of disaster survivors who actually are bearers of reason. Kaya ako ginagamit yung deliberative democracy dito kasi ang nagiging problema, ang tingin natin sa mga mahihirap ay mga tao na may pangangailangan, pero hindi mga tao na may katwiran. And in fact, if we listen to them, we will realize that their reasons are actually quite compelling. Diba? So halimbawa, I've attended a lot, well, not a lot, several city planning, collaborative planning exercise kung paano magkakaroon ng, what is this, parang mga bagong pabahay sa mga disaster survivors. Tatanggalin na sila dun sa may shoreline, ililipat sila sa paanan ng bundok. So, okay, medyo deliberative, inclusive in a way, I guess, kasi iba't ibang mga government officials, humanitarian organizations, merong participatory mapping. But the problem with that deliberative forum is that they speak for the poor, but they don't speak with the poor. And I think that is the problem. Kasi hindi natin na-appreciate yung arguments and reasons ng mga mahihirap mismo when we make these plans for them. And I think that's the problem. Kaya tuloy, yung mga pabahay sa Tacloban ngayon, yung iba sa kanila bumabalik dun sa mga hazard-prone area. Kasi syempre, kung mangangisda ka, bakit ka titira dun sa paanan ng bundok? Kailangan malapit ka sa laot, di ba? So I think that's a valid reason. And this is a reason coming from communities themselves. Pero dahil ang tingin natin sa kanila ay hindi bearers of reason, pero dahil sila yung mga taong dapat tulungan, ang nagiging diskurso tuloy, pasalamat nga kayo, may bahay na kayo eh. Pasalamat nga kayo, may banyo na kayo ngayon. May flush na yung toilet niyo eh. Yung dati nakatira kayo sa squatter, wala nga kayong banyo nun eh. Parang anong klaseng katwiran yan, di ba? So I think these kinds of plans wouldn't have taken off if the deliberation was actually linked to bringing in the perspectives of communities who are directly affected by this decision. And I think if you allow me, Louis, this is also the same problem with the COVID policies that we have in the Philippines right now. The way COVID-19 policies are constructed is coming from a middle-class orientation. Naalala ko yung first part ng COVID crisis, nasa TV pinapakita na, pag merong COVID sa bahay, ilagay siya sa isang kwarto, i-isolate siya, na parang, hello, if the family lives in a shoebox under a bridge, anong kwarto? Wala nga kwarto eh. It's so middle-class oriented. O kailangan may social distancing sa bahay. Paano magsa-social distancing kung nakatira na nga sa isang community na siksikan, di ba? So, I think it's another example na parang sana may sociologist sa IATF, di ba, na pwedeng makapagpaliwanag. Dito ba si Mother Mary? Baka na-high blood na rin si Professor Rosell is with me. Pero parang this is the point. Communities have reasons that are worth considering or definitely should be considered when we craft these policies. That is probably why we have a lot of failed policies in the Philippines, because these communities are spoken for, not spoken with, which is deeply, deeply problematic from a deliberative democracy perspective.
I guess again, I will point out to our audience, because again, majority of them are very young, and I think this is a good way of being inspired of how they can see themselves in the future and where they can work in terms of whether it's on research or on policy or in governance, because these are layers of communities, these are layers of governance and decision making that needs the discipline and the skills of sociology and sociologists to really make sure that policies that are being made, decisions that are being implemented are crafted well enough that it will really address the issue. And if we see that that's what's happening, that this is what's happening now because our policy makers or some of our government officials does not have an ear that listens to the social science even in general, then all the more that students would have the motivation to really understand what's happening and understand from a sociological or social science point of view, and hopefully do something in the future. Well, let's not wait for the future, but do something now, diba? And really participate and be relevant in discussions. I would like to read some comments. We'll reserve the questions later, but I'd like to read some comments. One is from Joseph Cadelinia. He said, social media is a bubble. The battle is so different on the ground. That's his comment. Diane Veloso from the LSU also said, the concept of ideal victims is similar to Jennifer Dunn's concept of worthy versus unworthy victims. And last for this batch, maybe we can hear from you just a reaction to these comments. Andoy from UP Diliman said, well, this is not a question, but more of a comment for reflection. I agree, he said, that we need to recognize modest successes. However, I want to push that label towards a more radical, constructivist sense. What does modest mean? I worry, he said, that to just take their achievements as modest tend to imply that their actions are not related to the broader waves of history. I see the difference between modest and heroic is socially and historically constructed. Hence, it is also important to unpack what we mean when we say these achievements as modest, because I believe they contribute to broader historical transformations, often seen as heroic. Comments on or reactions to these comments?
Yes, sige. These are very good comments. Let's start with Andoy's comment. The term modest is not pejorative. In fact, this is a reaction to, like when I present this to colleagues in Europe and I talk to them about these achievements, ang sinasabi nila sa akin, is that good enough? Na parang, are you happy that they're actually able to harass someone from the NHA to actually give them their house? Where is social transformation? How does this solve the deficits of Philippine democracy? So that is where I'm coming from. I'm pushing back against perspectives that always say, this is not enough, this is not enough. What they're doing is so micro-political, it's not enough. But if you are from that context, actually that's pretty big. That is product of everyday democratic labor that has direct impact on people's everyday lives. To say that it's modest does not mean that it's meek. May kaibahan yun eh. Being modest and being meek, being humble and being meek is different. It's not to say that they don't have bigger political aspirations of reforming society. It doesn't mean that they have no broader aspirations of how they can transform their city. Of course there is. But I hesitate to say that what they're doing is not enough just because they're not connected to a radical struggle, however Andoy defines what radical means. I don't want to impose a bigger political project to them if they feel turned off with that radical political project. And I think this is why I love Wataru Kosaka's work on moral politics in the Philippines, kasi iba rin yung galaw nila politically that maybe does not connect to how we ourselves as academics think about what politics looks like. So what is a way forward? I think a way forward is for people like me who has done this research and people who are also doing similar kinds of research to continue listening and spotting different ways in which these communities organize and achieve their political aims. And to think that they are not making a big dent in how our democracy is organized is not necessarily problematic, because that's imposing such a high standard for people who are already making such a big difference in their everyday lives. Yung comment ni Diane about what is it, deserving victims and
worthy versus unworthy victims. Yeah.
Yes, actually, my only addition to that is this does not just apply to people who survive disasters. This actually applies to our concept of citizenship. In the Duterte regime, what is a good citizen? Obedient, compliant, hindi pasaway, supportive. And what is a bad citizen? A bad citizen is critical, ngawa na ngawa, hindi naman tumutulong, di ba? And I think these parallelisms are so similar. This is why the criticism against citizens who are critical, who are speaking up against this government, Duterte did not invent this. The troll army did not invent this. If we look at how the Philippine discourse unfolded in the aftermath of a disaster, ganun din naman eh. Parang, oh, bakit kayo nagrereklamo na baka may corruption dun sa administration ng Yolanda? Shush, tumahimik ka na lang, tumulong ka na lang. These are implicit silencing discourses that this regime did not invent, but it's certainly amplified. Which I guess brings me to the first comment about social media and filter bubbles. Absolutely, it is. This is exactly why, as sociologists, we engage in our filter bubble, but we also get out of it and be part of something uncomfortable that will challenge our assumptions all the time.
Thank you for that. I'd like to bring in one more point in the discussion of the book, and in your arguments, you've said that the presidency, the current administration, is, well, one way or another, a byproduct or an unintended consequence of what happened during particularly in that area of your study. The support that the survivors gave this current administration, for example, is a product of them needing something and him being there to provide. That's one. And then I'll follow it up with the concept of presence. Right? Because I think presence is a very significant concept when it comes to disasters and tragedies like this. But I'll let you answer first on how things connect between what happened then and Duterte, for example, being president today.
Yeah, so actually before, I think like many of us, before the 2016 presidential elections, I mean, I've heard of Rodrigo Duterte. I've heard of this urban legend na mayor na nagpakain ng yosi sa turista. Yeah, of course, we hear these stories. We hear about Human Rights Watch investigating death squads. Pero parang it's really just peripheral in my brain. And I think this is my weakness as someone who grew up in Manila, living overseas now, na parang very ignorant of these developments in Davao. Pero naalala ko na when he ran for president, naalala ko na like even the taxi driver na suki kami, parati niyang kinikwento na dumating si Sara Duterte at namigay ng pera, walang pa-picture. Or may mga kwento na dumating si President Duterte at nung Yolanda, again, walang pa-picture, quiet lang, namigay ng pera, wala na yung parang pa-audit na kaya naging problematic din yung sa Aquino administration from their perspective kasi they were so audit obsessed. Ito na parang, okay, kailangan niya ng pera, namigay ng pera. Quietly, no fanfare, but he was present. And I think at that time, and recently ko na lang din napansin yun when I was writing the book, apparently nag-resonate sa ibang respondents yung, I guess more middle-class respondents nga yung YouTube video. Well, it was on YouTube, pero video ni President Duterte, then Davao City Mayor, when he landed in the Davao airport and then he was being interviewed by local journalists. Kasi never daw siya nagpa-interview sa Tacloban, pero pagbalik niya sa Davao, nagpa-interview siya. And if I may quote, so rated PG, so nung in-interview si President Duterte, parang I think he said something like, motherfucker, God must have been elsewhere when the typhoon hit. Na parang typical Duterte, di ba, na nagmumura, naggalit, pero you can see the sincerity and the frustration na bakit hindi pa matulungan yung mga tao. And I think at that time, for some people, I'm not saying everyone, that resonated kasi parang this man really captured their frustration and their anger at a time when the president of the Philippines just said, buhay pa naman kayo, di ba? So parang ang laki nung disconnect with a decente president versus this foul-mouthed but compassionate president. So for me as an ethnographer, that was really confronting kasi ito na yung time na nagre-rape joke si President Duterte, ito na yung time na parang ang foul na nung language niya about extrajudicial killings. This was around March, April, and then a day or two before the elections. I was also with a research team in Tacloban at that time, and I spent some time with some of Duterte's supporters. And I think doon ko rin naintindihan bakit sa tingin nila, and this is the way they framed it, kitang-kita to maraming posters na ganito kahit sa downtown na it's our turn to help him. Yung concept ng reciprocity, which I guess for other people will be interpreted as patronage politics, di ba? Or pagbabalik ng utang na loob. Pero for them, and again, medyo middle-class respondents din to, for them, it's their way of saying thank you. It's a way for them to assert their dignity na, okay, tinulungan niya kami dati, turn na namin ngayon, natulungan siya, lalo na pinagkakaisahan si Duterte ng media at that time. So, I think, yeah, for anyone who's doing sociological research, it's really very difficult to study and be empathetic with respondents na hindi ka sumasang-ayon. And I think for me, I was really very, very clear with my respondents in saying, I don't support this kind of language, but thank you for sharing your stories with me. So medyo awkward lang, and well, I'm still friends with some of them until now.
Some. And I'd like to pause on that concept of presence. I think that was key, at least in the case of Duterte. And during that time, one of the very big issues was the absence of aid and support coming from the national government. Of course, coming from the local government, although they themselves are victims of the disaster, but people were looking for and was really wanting for help and for assistance coming from the national government. But in the first few days of immediately after the disaster, was those who were first to go there and provide assistance are non-government organizations, international non-government organizations. This particular incident has been a global news because of the magnitude of the effects to lives, to property. So who was there were non-government organizations and international non-government organizations. So I was thinking, how does presence play in a particular time of misery and of disaster? How does the presence of non-government organizations change or shape or re-images how the government is seen from the ground? Did it lead to the government losing value? Did it lead to the government losing trust from people? How did you see that from the experience of the people on the ground?
So, of course, we have to clarify which part of government we are talking about here. I have to admit that on the level of the local government, and here we are talking about Mayor Romualdez, obviously there is a strong discourse actually that he was present. So, of course, it's not a unanimous impression, but I think it's resonant na parang they're showing love and support and appreciation for the physical presence of the mayor who was there during the disaster. And I guess that's also another challenging part for me kasi parang ano ba yan, Marcos regime na naman. We're talking to Marcos apologists here, but again, that's a different story. But I guess you're right, Louis, the object of discontent really was the way President Aquino really did not spend enough time in Tacloban. Usually pupunta siya sa Tanawan or nearby cities or municipalities, pero parang yung mga residents ng Tacloban, meron silang feeling na nasnub sila. And again, from, if we're thinking about this in very, Weberian terms, what is an ideal bureaucracy, what is an ideal form of governance, we could easily say na hindi naman niya kailangan pumunta doon, di ba? Kailangan lang niya siguraduhin that the systems are working, kailangan lang niya siguraduhin na yung mga NGOs may coordination. It doesn't have to be physically present there. That was certainly my impression at that time, not yet as a researcher, but as a citizen, na parang, yeah, that's not what presidents do. But then I think this is the power of field work. Kasi doon ko mas naunawaan kung bakit pala mahalaga na ang mga politiko pumupunta isa-isa, kalye kada kalye dito sa mga mahihirap na communities. Kasi parang yung mere fact na pumunta daw siya doon, napawisan, nakipagkamay, already uplifts their dignity. Kasi hindi daw nila maiintindihan kung ano talaga yung nangyayari kung hindi sila mismo nandun. Meron ding distrust doon sa parang I challenge my respondents sometimes na parang hindi ba okay lang yun na parang may DSWD social worker naman na yun na pumunta dito, malamang i-report nila sa headquarters. Ang sinasabi ng ibang respondents, hindi nila yun i-report. Siyempre, hindi nila sasabihin na nagugutom kami. Bakit nila yun sasabihin? Hindi sila yung nasira, di ba? So parang, actually, oo nga. Kaya for them, it's important that the leaders themselves are physically present to first ensure accountability. Yung sila mismo yung makapagsasabi na, President, wala na kaming makain. There is something uplifting, dignifying about that. And it's also the leader's way of humbling themselves and trying to understand the situation from the ground. So parang medyo nag-iba yung perspective ko dito. Hindi na ako very critical sa mga politiko na nakikipagkamay, nakikipagbeso, humahalik sa babies. Parang, okay, gets. Mahalaga pala siya. So, of course, we can debate whether this matters or not. Pero yung lang sa point about NGOs, so, yun nga nako-contrast yung presence ng NGO sa presence ng executive government. So, I heard some stories na buti nga si Justin Bieber pumunta dito. Yung presidente nga hindi pa napunta dito. So, parang merong ganong klaseng comparison. But of course, that said, I recognize that there are challenges of governance, that it's important that governance is depersonalized and bureaucratized. I get that. But I guess this is my way of sharing what I learned from the field and taking the side of my respondents who actually say presence is important.
Okay, so again, we'll reserve the questions later. Maybe I'll just throw in our second batch of comments coming from our participants. Sobrang dami. Sobrang gusto nilang talagang maka-engage with the discussion. So Howie from Max Planck Institute and PUP said that the way in which you analyze the poor's decision-making and political action bears a resemblance with Lauren Berland's cruel optimism. Another comment coming from, well, that's a question. Okay, here's a comment coming from Sharon Macagba from UP Los Baños. That is what I appreciate about sociology as a planning practitioner. It puts forward a better understanding on how we should plan our communities. Ang call talaga ng ibang planning practitioners ay ma-include ang mga tao sa diskurso ng planning. May kakabit rin siya syempre na planning process issues like maraming levels ang participation or pwede mong i-politicize ang participation. Pero para sa akin, sabi niya, mas okay na i-deal ang mga ganon or mga ganong planning process issues kesa sa hindi marinig at ma-include ang concerns ng mga tao. Last for this batch from Dakila, he said, Nix, on the subsequent comments on Duterte and Yolanda and also Kidapawan is actually an important image in understanding the malasakit of the matapang and malasakit slogan. So what are your thoughts from these three comments?
Yes, I agree with Dakila. And of course, shout out to Dakila, one of the best ethnographers I've met who's working on Tacloban. So follow his work. Yung kay Sharon about progressive planning, yes, I completely agree. And in fact, when people ask, nagmamatch ba yung deliberative democracy sa structure ng governance ng Pilipinas? In fact, yes, na parang in principle, the way our local development councils are designed with NGO representation, ideally, the NGO representative should not come from Rotary or Lions Club, pero sana galing siya talaga sa, let's say, peasant communities, for example. So the structure is there. The local development code really was structured in a way that is conducive to deliberative practice. Yung consultation is very much in the spirit of deliberative democracy, and even our constitution, diba? It's a constitutionally enshrined right for participation. So thank you to Sharon, and I hope sociologists can talk to more progressive planning practitioners like yourself. And Howie, I'm not sure if this is the Howie I know, but if you are the Howie I know, hello, and thank you for bringing cruel optimism to my attention. I haven't read up on it, so thank you. Babasahin ko yan.
Okay, so maybe this is my last question before we proceed to the questions coming from the participants. So moving forward, I know that the locale and the context of the book is very specific, but the discussions and the reflections, realizations on how democracy works is long lasting. And to you, comparatively, for example, and given the condition that we are in right now, and with COVID and the pandemic, how would you define tragedy now? How would you define disaster? To be more frank about it, how would you consider the current context as a disaster, a tragedy, and how do you think what happened in Tacloban and how they collectively gathered for a process of democracy could be replicated or could also happen, okay, in this particular situation and moving forward?
Yes, when you mentioned the question earlier, parang hindi ako nakaisip ng magandang sagot kasi how do I define disaster and tragedy now? So siguro babalik ako dun sa default perspective ko, which is very constructivist, di ba? Na parang the definition of a disaster and a tragedy is not a given. I think the way we should define this is how our collective experiences give a label to what we are experiencing right now. Yung last chapter ng book, actually, yun nga, si Bad cited it a while ago, yung last chapter niya is like a kite in a hurricane. I did not invent that metaphor, actually. Plagiarized ko siya sa James Bond film. Si Javier Bardem yung nagsabi nun. But I think that is the way I would interpret a tragedy or a disaster now. When we think about democracy in a time of tragedy or in a time of misery, democracy is like a kite in a hurricane. Na pwede pa rin siyang lumipad, but it's being drawn to different directions. It's precarious. Pero let's not forget na meron din nagko-control ng kite. And the question is, who is that collective? Who is that strong man? Who is that person navigating the kite? So yeah, to answer your question, is it a tragedy? Is it a disaster? I think the definition is a work in progress. Let's always contest how we want to remember this experience. I think if we come from more narrative sociology perspective, I think my invitation, especially to the young students watching us today, is to think about 10 years from now, if you tell this story to, I guess they're too young, no? They still won't have children 10 years from now. Sa mga jowa nyo 10 years from now, what story would you like to tell them about this experience of the pandemic? What story do we want to construct when we say this is the new normal? Who defines it? Who gives life to it? And I think this is exactly the reason why we shouldn't take discourse and discussion for granted. Huwag tayong maniniwala dun sa mga tao na nagsasabi, and this is a critique to deliberative democracy all the time, na salita lang yan, you always talk, you always just have conversation, it has no material impact. I disagree, because the way we see the world, the way we define our social realities is created through these conversations. It's not a reality out there to be found. It's a reality we construct together based on the stories we tell each other. So I guess the challenge is, what story do we want to construct at this critical juncture in our collective life?
Thank you. At least I guess that's all from me. And I think it's time to ask the more challenging questions. Kasi mas mahirap magtanong yung ating mga audience eh. Mas mahirap sagutin yung mga tanong nila. And for this part, I'd like to invite again Sir Baz to join me and help me in throwing into our plenary speaker, Nicole, questions coming from the participants. Sir Baz?
Wala. Right. Hello?
Yes, Sir Baz, we can hear you.
Yes, sorry, nag-enjoy ako dun sa discussion and sobrang dami na rin questions that we have to entertain. Okay, I think we have to start with yung mga not so familiar names for us. Let's start with Brent Alilain. Doc Nicole, what then is the collective action towards the great silencing of discourses which is greatly amplified in the Duterte administration?
Sasagutin na agad. Pwede mag-collect muna para makapag-isip muna ako.
Okay.
Sorry, Brad, ang hirap ng tanong. Isip muna ako.
Okay, and then after that, we also have another question coming from Doc Phoebe. I'm just reading from the sequence of the group chat. Doc Phoebe, Ma'am Bebot said, could you share to us distinctive processes engaged by People's Search that made effective people's mobilizations as opposed to governmental institutional responses to Yolanda victims' needs? So
Okay.
parang she would like to look at how People's Search as a collective non-government organization did it in Tacloban.
I think yung main contribution of People's Search is how they put Yolanda as part of the global conversation. And I think this is one big contribution that creative social movements have when it comes to disasters. If we look at the pictures and videos of how People's Search conducted their protests, it's very colorful, very dramatic. Halimbawa, may isang protest sila na nag-meet yung mga nagmarcha galing sa Samar, sa mga nagmarcha galing sa Tacloban, nag-meet sila sa San Juanico Bridge. Parang wow, it's so symbolic. And the way it was photographed was really just shown all over the world. So siguro dun sa mga nag-hesitate na, ano ba na-achieve ng mga protesta na yan? Well, I think this was very much part of the global conversation on climate justice, hindi lang climate change reform, pero climate justice talaga, that there are peasant groups, that there are fishermen who are disproportionately affected by a disaster of the magnitude of Typhoon Yolanda. So I think that is how I appreciate this. People's Surge gave a counter-narrative to the narrative that the national government was putting forward. The narrative of the national government was, everything's under control, we're a grateful nation, thank you for your donations, we're back on our feet. And then you have this mass mobilization saying, no, we're not back on our feet, we're angry, we're grieving, but we're angry. And I think that is such a strong global message that connected to global solidarities against fighting for climate justice. Yung question ni Brent about collective action of silencing, totoo naman, if we think about how silencing takes place today, it's undeniable that there is a systematic attempt to hijack the conversations in the form of paid troll armies. Let's not deny that, huwag na tayo magpaka-plastic, and this is obviously conducted by the supporters of President Duterte. Should I worry? Kasi may mga anti-libel kami na anti-terror or whatever, baka sabihin akong fake news. So Duterte supporters. But the point is, okay, there is paid collective action to silence people in the most, I think, what's scary about the troll army is because they make engaging online so unpalatable. Na parang if I tweet something against criticizing this government, kinakabahan ako magbukas ng Twitter kinabukasan kasi naka-jam lahat ng mga troll responses dyan. And hindi ko na makita kung alin talaga yung notifications from my friends and yung pag-jam ng troll armies. This is not insignificant. I think making the social media experience unpalatable is really a clever way of making people disengage from social media. So how do we respond to this? Actually, I don't know. Some say there is a technological solution. So Twitter has become better at filtering troll comments. So some say there is a technological solution. Others would actually say then even more reason for us to fill our digital public sphere with reasons that are other regarding, inclusive, and uplifting to the voices of those who are not often heard in our filter bubbles. How exactly that collective action will take place, I don't know, because when we think about social media, we don't talk about this in relation to collective action as in there is a unified action. Successful social media campaigns are organic, they're fragmented, they coalesce for a particular moment, but then they disintegrate. Fleeting siya. That is the character of a social media campaign, right? And I think the challenge for us is to appreciate that kind of space that's available there and how that can be scaled up in spaces outside the fleeting, temporary character of voice and silencing online.
Okay. Sir Buds, question?
Yes, thank you, Nicole. Let's take this question from Trixie Beato. Hello, Dr. Curato. Congratulations on your award and your book. As you've done your work with communities and focusing on vulnerable populations, I think an important question to ask for our budding researchers is this. How do you ensure that they are a part of the process of knowledge production? How do you follow up with the communities that you work with post-field? Thank you.
Okay. Mahirap to. Actually, hindi kasi ako yung kind ng researcher na naniniwala na responsibilidad kong i-organize yung mga respondents ko. Una sa lahat, wala akong ganong competence. Na parang sobrang introvert ko in real life, so hindi ko kaya mag-organize ng mga communities. Instead, I think I would limit, maybe for others this is too conservative, but I think my role as a researcher is to make sure that the stories I said in the book resonate with them and it's a story that they accept. One of my biggest regrets actually is not being able to go back to the field to return the book to the respondents. So dito na papasok yung isang research associate namin, hindi ko pa napapasalamatan, si Bianca Franco. So what Bianca did was to help me put together a short book in Waray, translated, that summarizes the findings of the book without the academic jargon, but the argument is there. And yung plan sana namin is, I think it was around March or April. Kailan ba yun, Bads? We were supposed to go at March. We were supposed to go to Tacloban and have this mini book launch with the communities na nakasali dito sa libro. Ayun nga lang, nagka-pandemic, so hindi siya nangyari. So to Trixie, I think my response to your question is, I hope I'm not disappointing you when I say that I see my role as a researcher is not to organize or enlighten my respondents. I was the one enlightened by this research process. And I think my only goal in going back to the field is to share with my respondents what was in the book and allow them to challenge me. I may have misrepresented something. The book is not a perfect project. I may have misinterpreted some of them. So I'm very much ready for that kind of criticism and have that conversation with them as well.
Okay, we have a couple of comments as well. Allow me to read this. Jerasol Dagunan from UP Los Baños said, anchoring on the conflict theory, I really think that the lower classes, especially those who come from the poorest of the poor, were the most affected sector because there was ambiguity or vagueness when it comes to defining terms such as storm surge. I also believe that if it was properly and simply defined by the media, people could have been more vigilant on the severity of the disaster. Diane followed up with this comment and said, I agree with Jerasol. I am from Tacloban. And I attest to the way some people there did not know that what storm surge meant, or that storm surge meant a mini tsunami. Okay? The Astrodome, which is in front of the sea, was one of the evacuation areas which amplified the risk. Your reaction to these comments?
Yes, I absolutely agree, which I think reinforces the point that when we talk about disaster communication, sana two-way yung discussion, yung hindi manggagaling lang sa scientist, yung labels, and then I think I said something about this nung nag-erupt yung Taal volcano. They were using a technical term to explain what's happening in the Taal volcano, and I was like, ako mismo hindi ko naiintindihan what it means. In the same way, I don't know what a storm surge means if it weren't for Typhoon Yolanda, right? So I think one message here is that these announcements or these signals should be co-designed with poor communities in language that we all understand. Ang problema kasi, nagkakaroon ng discourse na, mag-aral kasi kayo, mag-pay attention kasi kayo sa science classes nyo, hindi kasi kayo nakikinig sa teacher. Parang, ano ba, disaster na, magsisisihan pa tayo kung sinong hindi nakinig sa teacher, magsisisihan pa tayo kung sinong absent. Whereas, there could have been a more empowering, voice-affirming mechanism to listen to how we can where ordinary citizens can define these terms using a language that we can all understand. So sana our scientists, our experts, there's no room for elitism here. I think there's a lot of room for humility to co-construct these signals.
Right. Thank you. Let's take this question from, I think she's a BA Sociology student, Catherine Katipon. I think this is also a comment. Let's go back to Duterte topic. So I think this perspective of Duterte as a presence that the Aquino administration lacked is a perspective that needs to be more recognized and valued by those who oppose Duterte. Yes, he has certainly committed human rights violations, but where people come from in support for Duterte is from an earnest, legitimate place, even if it means having to ignore his actions. Comment, Mamix?
Yeah, sige, let's discuss this elephant in the room, diba? 91% satisfaction rating of the president. I've been involved in so many Facebook arguments about this. How do we make sense of this? And I think the first way for us to make sense of this is not to, first of all, dismiss Pulse Asia as fake, in the same way that Duterte called Rappler fake, just because the reports are unpalatable. I think as citizens, we must not, I guess, engage in the same anti-democratic practice that our anti-democratic leaders are doing. Just because some forms of news don't align with what we think doesn't mean it's fake. So this is my defense of that survey. So, okay, we can debate research methods, we can debate sampling methodologies of Pulse Asia, but we can also just acknowledge that, okay, kung hindi man 91%, if you don't believe it's 91%, we know it's still high, right? And this is why I appreciate Catherine's intervention. I think we also have to acknowledge that a lot of these justifications are visceral. Kaya hindi natin ma-appreciate ang support kay President Duterte if we use the standard logic of, akala ko ba humirap ang mga Pilipino based on the last survey, and then in the current survey, humirap na nga sila pero mahal pa rin nila si President Duterte. Anong nangyayari dyan? Well, that is exactly the problem. We think about public opinion as if they were neat, as if they were logical. Now, what we forget is that politics is visceral, it is emotional, it is filled with anxiety, and it's always constantly negotiated, right? So yes, I totally agree with Catherine to dig deeper and listen better in terms of the rationalities why the country still predominantly supports the president, even if it's not 91%. I think the message is still very clear. The president still enjoys wide support.
Okay, maybe last two, one from me and one from Bads. This is from Isabella Rodriguez from Mariano Marcos State University, province of Ilocos. This is a comment po, she said. We cannot blame people for shouting their concern or opinion on social media because there is a freedom of speech. If you disobey them, you will lose the so-called rights of a person to rise or to raise their concerns or opinions. And also rising concern or opinions from the citizens, it helps the government officials think what is the right thing to do. to solve a problem. But if you use the social media, we should know the limitation of the platform. That's her comment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a limited platform. Let's not think of this platform as the savior of our failing democracy. So I think the question now is, given the limitations of this platform, knowing how algorithms shape the way we understand conversations online, how algorithms curate these conversations online, what can we reasonably do, right? So I think yeah, we can appreciate the freedom of speech on social media, albeit with limitations now, given the context of this regime. But I think my only message is, yes, exercise your voice, but exercise your voice to give voice to others. And I think dun magaling ang social media, it can amplify. So it's a question of, yes, saying your opinion, but also trying to share the platform and share the attention to other people.
Okay. We're down to our last question. I know there is still a lot of questions coming in, but I would like to inform you that you can engage Nicole through her Twitter, or you can send her an email. And we will also share forward these questions to her so she can answer to you or through email or in other platforms. So we have one last question from your colleague in Canberra. We have Cleve Arguelles here. Hello, Nicole. Cleve here. Thank you for your discussion and congrats on the VAM Award. Can you also talk more whether conditions of misery can negatively affect the reason-giving capacities of people? I'm not sure if this is even the right question to ask, but yes, how would extreme levels of inequality in our miserable societies matter to deliberative democracy?
Right. Thank you, Cleve. I think my answer to that question is in, I think, first part of the book. Merong theoretical discussion doon about the importance of voice. Because the book obviously talks about how misery can enliven voice. Pero in fact, merong isang part nga doon sa debate na we should also respect how some people who are miserable choose silence. And silence is an equally important form of communication. So yung example na ginamit ko doon sa book draws actually from medical sociology. There was a sociologist who was diagnosed of cancer, and then naasar siya na yung approach is, okay, you have cancer, let's talk about this, let's process this, let's talk about this in therapy. But then that sociologist actually said, don't you understand? My misery is unspeakable. That's precisely what I don't want to discuss. And there's an argument that people who choose to stay silent sometimes choose to do so because it maintains their dignity. They feel like not talking about their misery is a way of keeping their identities intact. So I think, yeah, I very much appreciate the intervention. Even if the book is so voice heavy, it's so celebratory of what people are saying and doing. A big part of the discussion about deliberative democracy now is very much about strategic silences. Some social movements are already doing this. Like, for example, there is a forum na pinatawag ng Estado, but some, for example, in Australia, for example, some indigenous movements will say, we won't be part of that because that is a settler colonialist state. We will not be part of that. So exit and silence is also an example of a very strong way of articulating opposition.
And with that, we thank Dr. Nicole Curato for a very fruitful, I don't know, how do we do a virtual clap for Dr. Nicole Curato for this very rich, very informative, and very fruitful discussion. It's always a pleasure discussing with Nicole, and thank you to our participants for your very difficult questions. I'm sure Nicole really had a hard time answering most of them. Thank you, Dr. Nicole Curato. And to award our electronic e-certificate to our plenary speaker, may we call on the President of the Philippine Sociological Society, Dr. Mario Mayong Aguja, to award the certificate. But while waiting for Doc Mayong, Nicole, they would just want to know, maybe this is your chance to plug your book. They would want to know where they could get a copy of your book?
Yeah, so this is the bad news. The book is only sold by Oxford University Press at the moment. Even I wouldn't buy it because it's so expensive. So what I would suggest is for you to recommend the book to your library. And then I think it's on Google Books, so you can also look at some of the sections. And if there's a particular chapter that you think is valuable for you, please don't hesitate to send me an email as I guess my gift to share to everyone who participated in this plenary session. So yeah, for now, please encourage your libraries to order the book until it is on paperback.
Okay, so I guess Doc Mayong is still having difficulty getting in, but maybe ask Sir Bads, Vice President of the Philippine Sociological Society, to read the citation in the certificate.
Right. Okay. We are proud. I think Sir Mayong is already here.
Okay.
All right. Sir Mayong. All right. Okay, let's proceed. The PSS is proud to award this certificate of appreciation to Nicole Curato, Associate Professor from the University of Canberra, in grateful acknowledgement for the invaluable time and expertise shared as plenary speaker during the Philippine Sociological Society Annual National Conference with our theme, Transitions, Transgressions, and Transformations, held on October 2 to 9 via webinar, jam, and Zoom. This is issued on October 8, 2020 in Quezon City, Philippines. I think Sir Mayong is here. Can you add more to this recognition, sir?
Yeah, sa pangalan ng Philippine Sociological Society, gusto naming papaabot ang aming pasasalamat for Nix for joining us in today's conversation in such a very important topic as deliberative democracy, and also for inspiring a new generation of sociologists that indeed sociology is not a boring field, but rather a more interesting one, and it brings prospects to future of a new generation. So maraming salamat, Nick, sa ngalan ng PSS at ng lahat ng kasama natin sa webinar na ito sa araw na ito. Thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Louis, Bads, and everyone who took part in this webinar.
Thank you. And again, virtual clap for Dr. Nicole Curato. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, friends from the Philippine Sociological Society, a very insightful discussion with Dr. Nicole Curato. Thank you very much, Nix. To proceed to the next part, this is very short. We would like to call on as well, again, Vice President of the Philippine Sociological Society and the Chair of this year's Commission on Elections, Septrin Calamba, to formally announce the winners of this year's PSS election for the new members of the Board of Directors. Sir Bads?
Right. Thank you, Sir Louis. We have come to the point. Finally, we have already the result for the PSS election for the PSS Board of Directors for 2021 and 2022. We closed the voting yesterday at 3 p.m. and we started the canvassing at exactly 4:30 p.m. In behalf of the COMELEC committee, we have Dr. Phoebe Sanchez from UP Cebu, Professor Andoy Evangelista from UP Diliman, Professor Conifern Miranda from Caraga State University, and Ms. Bianca Isabel Franco from UP Diliman. We congratulate for the new members of the Philippine Sociological Society Board of Directors for 2021 and 2022. And these are the winners. Please look at the screen. We have Hannah Nario Lopez from University of the Philippines, Diliman, followed by Prince Kenex Aldama from University of the Philippines, Los Baños. And third, we have Professor Raquelin Humawan Dadang from Central Mindanao University. Next, and lastly, we have Professor Josephine Junicio from University of the Philippines, Diliman. Again, in behalf of the COMELEC, thank you so much for participating in the election. And please, tomorrow, join us for the closing ceremony for the oath taking of our new set of officers for PSS board. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sir Buds, and congratulations to the new members of the Board of Directors of the Philippine Sociological Society. If I'm not mistaken, they'll be serving for the years 2021 and 2022. So they'll be serving for 2 years in the board. Again, thank you very much, Sir Buds. And I believe that wraps up our session for today and for this morning. Just a few reminders. First, our parallel session E3 has been canceled, and the loan paper that registered for that session, titled Entrepreneurial Resilience: The Secrets Behind a Successful Micro Business, of Renan B. Abaya and co-authors, will be transferred to parallel session E2. Okay? So parallel sessions E1 and E2 will be at 8:30 in the morning tomorrow, Friday. That's our last day. Imagine it has almost already been a week, okay, of exchanges. Okay? So we'll have parallel sessions E1 and E2 tomorrow at 8:30. That will be followed by parallel sessions F1 and F2 at 10 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken. 10 o'clock for parallel sessions F1 and F2. Okay, so lastly, please do not forget to answer the evaluation form for this plenary session. Please be reminded that for participants to receive an electronic conference certificate of participation, you must attend 2 plenary sessions and 2 parallel sessions and answer the conference evaluation form. Lastly, again, I'd like to reiterate, for those who would like to be members of the Philippine Sociological Society, look at how exciting this society is. And this is an organization that you would really want to be part of. And I mean it. Discussions like this and engagements like this is well worth it. So please visit www.philippinesociology.com and click on the membership form and be a member of the Philippine Sociological Society. With that, this again is Louis Benedict Ignacio from Philippine Sociological Society and the University of Santo Tomas. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Enjoy the rest of the day and enjoy this is now your favorite song for our extra video. Thank you very much. Bye.
Karaniwang tao lamang, kayo't kabayo, yan ang alam. Karaniwang hanap buhay, karaniwan ang problema, pagkain, damit at tirahan. Di ko kabisado yang siyensya, ako'y nalilito sa maraming salita. Alam ko lang na itong planeta'y walang kapalit at dapat ingatan. Kapag nasira, sino ang kawawa? Karaniwang tao, saan ka tatakbo? Kapag nawasak, iisang mundo. Karaniwang tao, anong magagawa upang bantayan ang kalikasan? ay di pansin. Kapag naipon ay nagiging suliranin, kaunting basura ngayoy bundok, kotseng gabok ay umuusok, sabong panlabay pumapatay sa ilog. May lasong galing sa industriya, ibinubuga ng mga pabrika. Ngunit di lamang higante ang nagkakalat ng dumi, may kinalaman din ang tulad natin. Karaniwang tao, saan ka tatakbo? Kapag nawasak iisang mundo, karaniwang tao, anong magagawa upang bantayan ng kalikasan?